Our keynote speaker is no stranger to you all. Dr. Carson's inspirational story of being a troubled youth growing up in poor inner-city Detroit, going on to attending and graduating from Yale University, Yale Michigan School of Medicine, and then going on to interning with Johns Hopkins University, becoming the chief resident in neurosurgery and then director of pediatric neurosurgery at Hopkins, to going on to being a world-renowned neurosurgeon was so inspiring, even Hollywood had to make a movie about it. The movie was based on his book, Gifted Hands, was a great success, and I can only imagine what went through Hollywood's minds when he ran as Republican in 2016. Dr. Carson is a neurosurgeon, cancer survivor, book author, public speaker, former Republican presidential candidate, and most recently was sworn in as the 17th Secretary of the United States Department of Health, Housing and Urban Development. Appointed by President Trump and a member of his cabinet, the Secretary advises the President on housing issues, creates, implements policy, and oversees all programs in the department. Let's give a big warm welcome to the Honorable Dr. Ben Carson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's always good to be back in Texas, and I want to thank everybody for coming out and for caring, for really caring about our nation, because our nation, as you just heard, is in some turmoil right now. But I believe that we have by far the best country that ever existed in the world. And you know, people like to talk about it. They like to say, our system is uncaring, that we're cruel, that we're racist, that we don't treat people the right way. But if that was true, why the heck would people be forming caravans trying to get in here? Think about it. But what we're facing right now, the reason it's so nasty, why the vehement hatred is so prevalent, is because it's not about Republicans and Democrats. It's about people who love our nation and our system, and people who want to fundamentally change us into something else. And we have a fight on our hands. We have to do something about it. And it's really worth saving. You know, just very briefly looking back over my life, you know, raised by a mother with only a third-grade education. She got divorced early on because my father, she found out, was a bigamist, had another family. I remember telling that story at the University of Utah. Nobody thought it was that strange. Now, you know they don't do that anymore, okay? But it was a very difficult life early on, characterized by severe poverty, rats, roaches, violence. Both of my favorite older cousins were killed. I remember seeing people lying on the ground with bullet holes in them waiting to die. And when I was 9 years old, sitting on the ghetto stairs, looking through the building across the street, out of which all the windows had been broken, and a sunbeam was shining through, and it made me think about my future. And I remember thinking that I would probably not live to be more than 25 years of age, because that's what I saw around me. My mother was working so hard all the time, getting up at 5 in the morning and leaving the house and getting back after midnight. One job after another, cleaning other people's houses. At least that was her disguise, because she was really a spy. She wanted to know why these people who lived in these beautiful homes were so successful. And she noticed they didn't watch a lot of television. And they spent a lot of time reading, planning. So she came home one day and she imposed that on me and my brother. And we were not happy campers. And that's putting it mildly. I mean, if it were today's society, we probably would have called social services. They'd taken her away in handcuffs. But, back in those days, it was a little different. And, I was a terrible student. I was probably the worst student you ever saw. And all the other students teased me and called me names, but I could get back at them very easily because I was very good at one thing. That was getting other people kicked out of class. I was expert because I would study my classmates and I would figure out what made them really, really angry. And then I would just irritate them until they exploded, and then the teacher would kick them out, and I would say, yeah, this is great, because I wouldn't be the only one that didn't learn anything that day. But there was this one girl in class, and you all know this girl, Miss Goody Two-Shoes. Some of you probably were her. Everything perfect, pristine, made everybody else look like a jerk. I said, wouldn't it be nice to get her kicked out of class? So, lo and behold, that day she sat right down in the seat in front of me. And I said, the Lord is good. And, I waited till the teacher was coming in that direction. I started irritating her, and she was getting mad. I mean, the steam was coming out of her ears, and I knew just one more thing, and she was going to explode. But she didn't explode. She just quietly turned around, and she said, you and me on the playground at recess. So that didn't work out all that well. But, as I started reading those books that my mother made us read, even though we were desperately poor, between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere. I could be anybody. I could do anything. My horizons began to expand tremendously. And, I started reading about doctors and scientists, explorers and philosophers. And I came to the conclusion that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. And I stopped listening to all the people who were always blaming the environment and other people. And my brother did too. And just started reading and preparing ourselves. Within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all those kids who used to call me dummy, who are now coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I would say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. But that was perhaps a little obnoxious. But, things just kind of zoomed on, went to Yale, University of Michigan. I hear some booloos back there. Johns Hopkins. And by age 33, I was the director of pediatric neurosurgery. And I started doing a lot of things that were sort of cutting edge, so to speak. And, it just blossomed from there. So this country has been extraordinarily good to me. It required a lot of hard work, but that's okay. Because you look at what people put into this country. A lot of times, I hear people in Washington complaining about how tough it is to be a public servant. But we wouldn't even have a place to be a public servant if people hadn't put in a lot of elbow grease into this country before we got here. And we have to remember the sacrifices that they made and recognize that if we're not willing to make the sacrifices, what will happen to our children? What will happen to our grandchildren? But we find ourselves in a very difficult situation in this country right now because there are a lot of people who refuse to accept the results of the 2016 election. And they have just decided that they're going to resist and resist no matter what happens. And when you think about it, how silly is it to be resisting at a time when the unemployment amongst blacks and Hispanics and women is at a record low level? At a time when manufacturing is coming back, when people are starting new businesses, when people around the world are starting once again to have some respect for what's going on in this country. This is a time, let's put it this way. If the previous president was in office and this was going on, they'd be saying he's the greatest person who ever lived in the history of the world. And it's been amazing what's going on. And our president is not a choir boy. He's not a perfect individual. He recognizes that. But I got to tell you something. He is what we need right now. We need somebody who will push back on all this stuff. And those who want to fundamentally change this nation, they hate him because he represents all the things that they are trying to change. You know, it was interesting. There was an interview, it was 25 to 30 years ago, he was doing with Oprah Winfrey. Some of you might have seen that. And she said, "Donald, would you ever run for president?" And he said, no, I really wouldn't want to do that unless the country was going off the cliff and we were about to lose the country. That's the reason he actually ran. He didn't need any of this stuff at all. And they are doing everything they can to get rid of him. Why? Because in order for them to fundamentally change this country, there's a few things that they have to control. They have to control the schools so they can indoctrinate the young people. They have to control the media so they can indoctrinate the masses and spread political correctness everywhere. And they have to control the courts. Now, the first two they had. The last one they would have had if Hillary had been elected, which they totally expected, and he snatched it out from under their noses. That's why they're as mad as a wet hornet. And now they want to do everything they can to change the result of the election. And that's why all of this collusion stuff, which is absolutely going nowhere. So now they're going to start looking into other aspects of his life. They're just going to keep looking. You know, who can withstand scrutiny of everything they've ever done in their whole lives? It's a very dangerous precedent that is being set. And it's being used for other people. I mean, how many people remember the ridiculous Kavanaugh hearing? I mean, that was absolutely absurd. This is a man who has just led an exemplary life. And if he was a slime ball, believe me, it would have come out in all of these years. And instead, he gets nothing but praise from all these women that he has worked with over the decades. That tells you right there that it is just foolishness. But we live in a society where logic and common sense has gone right out of the door. You know, I think back in my own career. And I remember some years ago, a woman from New York accused me of molesting her younger sister. Now, if it had been in today's Me Too era, I don't know what would have happened to me. But of course, the university had to conduct an investigation. My lawyer had to get involved. The Attorney General of Maryland had to get involved. Attorney General of New York had to get involved. But their investigation quickly revealed that this woman had never actually met me, nor had her little sister, but she had sent a lot of letters and naked pictures and all kinds of things, and I didn't respond to them, so she was mad. And they told her if she ever contacted me again, she was going to jail. But what if it had been today's atmosphere? What would have happened to my career? We have to think about these things and the implications of what's going on in our society. And we also have to think about what is going to happen to our country when good people no longer want to serve. When they say, I'm not going to do that to my reputation and to my family. And I'm not so sure that that isn't the reason for some of the stuff that's going on. If they can get all the good people to stand down and to shut up, then they can easily proceed with changing this country. That's what political correctness is all about. It makes the good people shut up and not say anything, while the country continues to move further and further toward another system. And that's where all of us come in, because we have to stop being silent. We have to stop being like sheep, and we have to teach our children to stand up for what they believe in. If we don't do that, we are going to lose our country. There's no question about that. So it lies with us. And we have to recognize, there are many components to it, the media being one of them. Do you realize that the press is the only profession that is protected by the Constitution of the United States? There's a reason for that, because they're supposed to be objective and they're supposed to be able to disseminate to the people unbiased information whereby they can decide what their will is, because the country is supposed to be run on the will of the people. But when you have distortion by the media and manipulation by the media, you corrupt the entire system. And that's part of the reason that we're seeing what we're seeing right now. And every time I see a young journalist and I get a chance to talk to them, I remind them of what could happen if we had an honest media. And I encourage them to be part of the vanguard of changing it, because it doesn't have to continue this way. We can actually turn this around. This is America. This is a place where we have faced some awful challenges. This is perhaps the worst one, because it's more subtle. And it's changing the fabric of our country without a lot of people even recognizing what's going on. That kind of insidious damage is very, very difficult to control. But you can see the wills of hatred and division so active in our society today, creating wedges based on race and gender and income and religion, and particularly in terms of political ideology. But what we, the people, have to recognize is you don't have to agree with everybody. Just because you disagree doesn't mean you're enemies. And I'm fond of saying if two people agree about everything, one of them isn't necessary. And I think we're all necessary. It's just that we need to learn to be able to have discussions. And you'll actually find it quite amusing if you have a discussion with a lot of people on the left, because they can't go very deep into the discussion. before they start calling you names and calling you intolerant. And it's kind of fun to irritate them, to be honest with you. But, you know, they're trying to create a culture of conformity. Everybody says the same thing, they act the same way. Have you seen some of those futuristic movies about how everybody is just kind of like a zombie and they walk around, they all agree and they do the same thing? Smoke their pot, you know, just... It really is kind of sad. And you know, if I were trying to destroy a great country like this one, you know, I would know I couldn't do it militarily, but I would recognize that I could do it from the inside. If I got the people to hate each other, if I got people addicted to all kinds of drugs, if I started saying, you know, marijuana, that's pretty good stuff, you know. It's just a nice recreational drug. We just use it for medicinal purposes. Never mind the fact that people have flashbacks. Never mind the fact that there's strong medical evidence that it affects people's IQ, particularly in the undeveloped brain, and the brain continues to develop right into your late 20s. You know anybody in their late 20s who acts kind of strange in Congress? I don't know. I'm not mentioning any names, okay? But just think about it. And think about how rapidly our culture is changing. I remember about 9 years ago, I was in South Africa, and I was talking to the head of the ACLU. He was talking about how they speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, and the downtrodden, and how wonderful they are. And I told him about a woman who came to me 33 weeks pregnant. And she was on her way to Kansas to get an abortion. 33 weeks. Now, that's a baby who could survive outside the womb without a ventilator. And she had to go to Kansas because that was the only place where they would do an abortion that late. But her doctor had asked her to come and talk to me before she got the abortion because the child had a congenital anomaly of the brain. Fortunately, I was able to convince her to have the baby. She had the baby. I had to operate on the baby, but the baby's doing fine, and she loves the baby, and she's very glad she didn't kill that baby. But I said to him, I said, there is a person who was about to be killed and could not speak for themselves. Would you, ACLU, speak for that child? And he said, no. And I said, well, what about the ones in the neonatal intensive care unit, 25, 26, 27 weeks old, born prematurely? What about that one? And we're keeping that baby alive on ventilators and surfactant and other things. He said, oh, yes, we could advocate for that child. And I said, you can advocate for that one, but not for the one who is further developed and further along and is in the safest place they can possibly be. That one you can't. And he said, I realize that doesn't make any sense, but I believe a woman has the right to kill a baby until the second it is born. And I said, would you say that in public? He said, no. That was 9 years ago. Now they're willing to say it in public. This is how far we have come in this society. And if anybody in this room has ever seen an abortion, it is gruesome. They have the ultrasonic picture because they have to do an ultrasound so they can see how the baby is lying. and how big it is, and there are a whole bunch of calculations that have to be made. But then while you're looking at the screen, they introduce a tube into the uterus. Put it near the baby's feet. Turn it on, and it sucks up and grinds the baby up, and it comes out blood and gore in a tube. It is barbaric. And when they get older, to the point where they can't do it that way, they have to introduce sharp instruments and cut the baby's spine beneath the head. And how people can actually do something like that to a human being that could live on its own outside the womb. What happened to our morality? What happened to our sense of decency in this country? And I've also had the privilege of operating on babies that were still in the mother's womb. And I remember a young woman came up to my wife and she said, "Are you Mrs. Carson?" She said, "Your husband operated on me when I was still in my mother's womb." And there she was, a tall, beautiful young woman, perfectly capable of taking care of herself. And you know, that's the reason that no one will ever convince me that what is in a woman's womb is a meaningless bunch of cells. It never will happen. So conformity is not really equal to freedom. Freedom means we can control our own lives. We don't have to let somebody else or some other system control our lives. This is what we have to fight for. This is what the people fought for who created our nation. And the question is, are we willing to fight for it? You know, we're so close. You know, right here in Fort Bend County at the midterms, Senator Cruz got 43.6% of the vote. Beto O'Rourke got 55.7% of the vote. Pete Olson, 51%, and his opponent got 47%. Greg Abbott, 49.3%, his opponent 49.1%. You can see how close those races are. And what does that mean? It means that we have to be active in our spheres of influence. We have to be willing to go out there. We have to be willing to challenge political correctness. We have to be willing to talk about the things that made America into a great nation. We cannot capitulate. We have to be willing to face and challenge school boards and places that are teaching inappropriate things to our young people. You know, if we don't do that, then we just continue this gradual slide off the cliff. And, you know, I remember during my medical career, you know, I had to face sometimes criticism. I remember I went to Rome for the first international conference on human achondroplasia, the most common form of dwarfism. Because the little dwarf babies, 7% of them used to die in infancy. The reason they died in infancy is because of a complex, abnormal bony growth at the base of their skull, which was compressing their brainstem. And it was so tight, when people would try to go in and do something about it, they frequently killed them or crippled them. And at this conference, the geneticists and people were talking about advances and breakthroughs. And then it came my time to talk. And I talked about a new procedure we had developed to be able to alleviate the pressure without hurting the child. And they were just so angry, and they said, "You surgeons think you can do anything. You're the ones who kill them. If you just leave them alone, only 7% of them will die." And they were just angry. And I came back to Johns Hopkins. I continued doing the operation. People were complaining to the president of the hospital and the dean of the medical school, and even the Maryland Medical Society, and eventually the AMA. Carson's a wild man. You got to stop him. By that time, I had done enough of these operations to show that it was effective. Not a single one of them had died. And here's the nice thing about medicine. Evidence counts, and it actually changes the way people do things. And now, now achondroplastic babies don't die at a rate any higher than anybody else. But, in the government, evidence doesn't work quite as well. But that's something that we have to continue to work on. But the point being, you can't necessarily always just go with the flow and just do what everybody else is doing if we're going to make progress. And we're talking about our children. We're talking about our grandchildren. And what are we going to do? But one thing we must never forget, and that is there is a power much greater than ourselves which brought this country into existence. And it is our faith and our belief in God that has brought us this far, and we cannot abandon him now. I'll leave you with a story of a young man who had von Hippel-Lindau disease. And this is a disease in which tumors, very vascular tumors, will develop in different parts of the brain. And this one had developed in the middle of his brainstem. His wife was a nurse on the pediatric neurosurgery service. None of the adult neurosurgeons would operate on him because it was in the brainstem, an inoperable area. And she said, Ben, you're going to have to do this. I said, but I'm a pediatric neurosurgeon. She says, sometimes he acts like a child. So I went and talked to him, and I said, Craig, if I operate on this, there's a 50-50 chance that you will die on the table. And he said, I understand that, but if you don't operate, there's a 100% chance that I will die. I said, that's a pretty mature attitude, so I took him to the operating room, went down to the brainstem area. It was all covered over with abnormal blood vessels. I said, oh no, how are we going to get through this? But I just said, Lord, you have to guide me in this. And I was able to find a place where I could make a small hole in the brainstem and then put a probe in there until I felt something that felt different. And to grab that with a very small forceps, I couldn't see what I was grabbing, and start gradually pulling it out. At which time the anesthesiologist, who was very opposed to this operation, came and said, the evoked potentials have gone flat. This is like an EKG for the brain. He said, you killed him. I told you we're going to kill him. And there was a somber mood in the room as I did manage to get the tumor out, and we closed him up, left him on the ventilator, took him to the ICU. And when I came in the next morning, the breathing tube was out. He was sitting up in the bed cracking jokes. And I don't for 1 minute believe that that was my skill. I think that was God. And that same God is here today. And he is here to help us save this nation, because this nation has completely changed the world. Before this nation became a power, those of you who are history buffs, you know what the world was like. all these barbaric people just conquering one another and just doing horrible things. This country is, in fact, the hope for the world. And it's because we have not relinquished our faith. And some people say, you're not supposed to talk about God in public. Somehow that violates the concept of separation of church and state. But let me tell you something. There is nothing in the United States Constitution that talks about separation of church and state. And people who say that, what do they know about the origins of our nation? And do they realize that our founding document talks about certain inalienable rights given to us by our Creator, a.k.a. God, that the Pledge of Allegiance to that flag says we are one nation under God. Many courtrooms on the wall it says, in God we trust. Every coin in our pocket, every bill in our wallet says, in God we trust. So if it's in our founding documents, it's in our courts, it's on our money. But we're not supposed to talk about it. What in the world is that? In medicine, it's called schizophrenia. And doesn't that explain a lot of what's going on in our nation? And we need to make it perfectly clear that it's okay to live by godly principles of loving your fellow man, of caring about your neighbor, of developing your God-given talents to the utmost so that you become valuable to the people around you, of having values and principles that govern your life. And if we do that, not only will we make America great again, but we will truly have one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much.